Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. By now, you've probably heard that MSNBC's resident token talking head and professional attention whore Malcolm Nance has decided to join the war in Ukraine. Not as a correspondent for the white media, but as a, get this, combatant for the Ukrainians. Apparently he wants to literally go and fight for Ukraine. Just for the record, this guy is 61 years old. 61 years old. He's only a hop, skip, and a jump away from retirement at this point. Now, he was in the Navy for 20 years. That's a long time to be peeling potatoes, but I'm assuming that at the very least he got his Navy pension, if nothing else. Now, this is the part where you could insert some tasteless joke about how he'll most likely wind up becoming a casualty of not-so-friendly fire by the Ukrainians, but that would be getting ahead of ourselves. Now, for those unfortunate enough to have encountered Malcolm Nance on the internet or TV occasionally, this guy has been trying to make himself out to be some sort of super spy, the Black Jack Ryan, you could say. Every time you look up, he talks about we when talking about the CIA, and we when talking about the FBI, and we when talking about the U.S. military and government. A shame that Malcolm Nance never listened to Malcolm X, who warned about all of that we talk back in the day, but that's what Malcolm Nance has been trying to do. I remember when Valerie Plame got herself exposed by the W administration during the Iraq War, and, well, Malcolm Nance tried and failed to see if he could swing on her coattails. Now it seems that Nance has read one too many Tom Clancy novels, because now he's trying to live out some kind of absurd Jack Ryan fantasy where he goes head up against the Russians. Now, like a lot of these bootlicks, be they on the left or the right, Malcolm Nance, he's trying to find some way to make himself stand out among his would-be white media peers. So, like everything else that this guy's been doing the last several years, I'm sure that this is all part of some half-brained finesse. Malcolm Nance is no tough guy, though he certainly does want people to believe that he's some sort of real intelligence professional, some sort of high-level spy of some sort. Well, for his sake, I hope that Nance is part of some rear echelon group nowhere near any serious fighting, basically a glorified embedded reporter with camo fatigues. Otherwise, his latest attention-whoring stunt could wind up costing him his life, because Vladimir Putin doesn't really care whether or not Malcolm Nance is desperate to get himself another book deal. You know, Nance reminds me of the late, not-so-great Herman Cain. You remember the corporate executive, cancer survivor, and failed one-time presidential candidate who was just so eager to prove his undying loyalty to the white right that he wound up dying of COVID-19 because he chose to go to a Trump rally just to demonstrate his total devotion to the orange man. See, this is what these bootlicking Negroes for the right and the left have in common. They both want to go over the top, just go to outrageous lengths to prove to their white ideological supervisors how devoted they are. Anything to prove that they are more devoted to the cause than even their white peers. But only if the cause is an authorized one. You never see white left-wingers deciding to go fight along black people anywhere. The white media has plenty of military pundits on their shows. How many of them have volunteered to go fight in Africa or even in the streets of the United States on behalf of black people? And while there have been some white people of conscience who have marched, demonstrated, and even died in the process of helping to support black people in our struggle, how often has the white media lauded those white people for that? Has the white media compared Heather Heyer or the two men who Kyle Rittenhouse gunned down to Goodman or Schwerner? The white media never makes it a point to connect white people who are killed opposing racism today to those who died opposing it yesterday. No making heroes out of them. They'll do one or two insincere sympathy pieces, but then they'll immediately explain why the police are so popular and why people don't want the police punished, and let's bring on the police chief and have them as our celebrity expert to talk about why we need to get harder cracking down on those Negroes. What Malcolm Nance is doing is a sanctioned act. He has white power's permission to do this and still be part of their tiny club of approved-of Negroes. Speaking of approved-of Negroes, Joke Reed was lauding Nance for this idiocy, claiming that he's following in the tradition of black Americans who have volunteered to go help to fight for Europeans' freedom. And then, to try to sanctify this, she name drops Eugene Bullard.
And we know that there is a tradition of Americans and others going overseas to assist in wars overseas. Eugene Bullard is somebody who people think of in that way as an African-American young man, 19 years old, went over and fought in 2 world wars. So we know that there is a tradition of doing this.
I happen to be a little bit familiar with the Bullard story. He belongs right up there with Bass Reeves, in my opinion. Now, like a lot of you, I study the white media, and I recognize when they try to throw a rock and hide their hands. And for Joy Reid to name drop Eugene Bullard, who neither she nor anyone else at MSNBC or CNN has ever mentioned before, that stuck out like a sore thumb to me. Just this one and done mention and trying to scurry away before anyone notices. It's so out of place as to be an insult. Reid and her white media paymasters, they're actually trying to associate the buffoonish actions of Malcolm Nance with the genuine heroism of Eugene Bullard. And there were some other things that Joke Reid left out. Eugene Bullard was born in the late 19th century, a descendant of American slaves, aka FBA, in the purest sense of the term. Bullard was of Creek Indian ancestry, and by how dark his skin was, you can tell he came from the black Indians, not the red ones. During World War I, he enlisted in the French Foreign Legion and became a machine gunner and saw combat on the Somme. He was wounded at the Battle of Verdun, and while recuperating, he decided to apply to enlist in France's Air Force, the Aéronautique Militaire. The Aéronautique Militaire had a special squadron, the Lafayette Flying Corps, which was comprised mostly of Americans who volunteered to fly and fight for France. Eugene Bullard, as part of this unit, shot down enemy aircraft and earned himself a slew of military honors from the French government, including the Croix de Guerre. After his service in France, he returned to the United States, which was just getting into the war, the U.S. pulling up the rear as usual. The Army Air Corps was asking for anyone with flying experience to join. Keep in mind, this was the dawn of aviation. Other than crop dusters, there was no ready pool of pilots for them to draw from, so they were particularly desirous to have pilots with combat experience. So they were particularly interested in having pilots from the Lafayette Flying Corps because they were, of course, Americans, which Bullard had been a part of. So when Bullard went to apply to the Army Air Corps, he was promptly rejected because they only wanted white pilots. Joke Reid is talking about Eugene Bullard, a man who was not an immigrant on either side of his family. She herself is Congolese, so it begs the question, why doesn't she talk about the Congolese volunteers who flew combat missions for France in the First World War? Because this is not about getting people in the Congo to support what's going on in Ukraine. This is about getting black Americans to overlook all the racism going on there. And by the way, racism going on against fellow Africans like Joke Reid. It happens to be Africans from places like the Congo who the Ukrainians are discriminating against and who are mistreating and racially harming. And Joke Reid's not trying to make Congolese or the Africans into the face of black people supporting the war effort over there, black people volunteering to go fight and die over there. She's not trying to make Africans into the face of that. She's trying to make black Americans into it. But there's also another reason why Joke Reid brings up Eugene Bullard. It's because she has to. There is no substitute for the unique place that we as black Americans hold in the history of the world. As black Americans, we are the face of black achievement and valor in the world, and we have been for a long time now. No one else has our history. No one else has our record of exceptionalism. We have held up the standard for blackness in the world, and we have done so with singular distinction against the most oppressive conditions. Like it or not, whenever talking about what black people have done, it's practically impossible to do it without talking about us. And this is not some recent phenomenon. Our record of accomplishment goes back a long way. But getting back to the white media meat puppet Joke Reid trying to co-opt Eugene Bullard, you know the U.S. Air Force Museum has an exhibit of Eugene Bullard, even though they rejected him from service 100 years ago, and he never flew for the United States ever. The U.S. Air Force is trying to claim a black man who they did everything they could to distance themselves from. A black man who they did everything they could to keep out of an airplane. But then again, as Neely Fuller said, white supremacy believes in taking both sides of the argument. One more thing about Eugene Bullard, he was also active in the early civil rights movement. When Paul Robeson and other freedom fighters organized a fundraiser for the Civil Rights Congress, they were attacked by a white mob in what would come to be known as the Peekskill Riots. Eugene Bullard was one of the people attacked by the mob of white supremacist marauders during those riots. And just like with the Tulsa massacre, the Peekskill mob was being led by the police. The police were not simply hanging back or standing off to the side. The police were the main ones leading the charge to attack those black citizens who were simply demanding common decency, but white supremacy has no decency. See, Eugene Bullard was taking on the police in his day. Malcolm Nance never has. See, if Malcolm Nance was like Eugene Bullard, instead of cosplaying as a soldier for Ukraine, he would have been in those streets for the last 9 years or so, standing up to the white supremacists right here in the US. Because you see, Malcolm Nance, you didn't have to go to Ukraine to find people who were being subjected to a war of extermination. You didn't have to go to the other side of the planet just to find some people who were being indiscriminately attacked and killed by a violent authoritarian government and their gang of deputized murderers in the streets. You can find those oppressed people right here in the US, black people, like yourself. I'd like to know how many Ukrainians have made it a point to come over here to advocate for us, to fight for us, to take up arms against the white supremacists killing us here in the US. Can Malcolm Nance name any of his so-called Ukrainian friends who have come to the U.S. to help black people fight against the war being waged against us here? Can Joke Reed name for us the Ukrainian version of Eugene Bullard who came to the U.S. to fight for black people's rights to live our lives in peace? Somehow, I don't think so. This is why we don't want our enemies like the government, which the Air Force is part of, or the propaganda arm of white supremacy, which Joke Reed is a mouthpiece for, to be telling our history. And we certainly don't want self-serving opportunistic buffoons like Malcolm Nance to be making spectacles of themselves for the sake of promoting the con of black people being loyal to white supremacist interests. We also don't want them trying to tell us what qualifies as black valor or heroism. The white media has told everyone that Ukraine is the damsel in distress and must be saved from the Russian brute. Fine, but that's not our fight. And this white media hasn't said anything about Yemen, Sudan, or any of the other war zones where black people are fighting and dying. They don't talk about sanctions against the U.S. for the indiscriminate murders of black people being carried out by the state, that the government eagerly supports and protects. No talk about political consequences against the U.S. for any of that. Human rights violations happening right here and nothing being done about it. Oh, but it's Russia and their veto on the UN Security Council that matters. What Malcolm Nance is doing is easy. It's easy to dress up and play soldier like he did when he was in the Navy, and to get a pat on the back and kudos from white pundits and politicians in the U.S. because he's risking his life for a country that has been hideously discriminating against black people. I'm talking about Ukraine in this case, but the U.S. can also be added to that list because he represented the U.S. in the Navy as well. Malcolm's helping to blackwash Ukraine's anti-black racism. It takes no courage to do what he's doing because the white media and the white powers that be are not going to impose consequences for it. Nance doesn't live in Ukraine, and when he leaves there, it doesn't matter because he's only a tourist there anyway. What would take courage would be for Malcolm Nance to fight white power right here in the U.S. because he does live here, and there would be consequences for doing that. It would take courage to stand up to the lies of the white media, to call out the thugs in blue, to directly threaten and oppose the propaganda and enforcement arms of white supremacy. Which is why Malcolm Nance doesn't do that. What he's trying to do is to sell some books and to get some speaking fees for the inane lectures that he gives. This is about boosting his profile. So far, Nance's video on MSNBC has gotten over 1 million views in less than 18 hours, far and away outperforming anything else MSNBC's posted in days. He's been trending on Twitter. I'm sure he's very proud of himself. This shows us nothing about Malcolm Nance's courage, though it does tell us that he understands this is the game of media that he's playing. This is about bragging rights for him. Competition in the world of media is fierce, and you have to do something if you're going to stand out from the crowd. So long as he avoids catching a bullet or a stray cruise missile, Malcolm Nance can spin the outcome any way he needs to. If Ukraine wins the war, you can bet that Malcolm Nance is going to be portraying himself as having single-handedly defeated the Red Army, why his 161-year-old behind turned the tide for the Ukrainians. He'll go from peddling absurd Jack Ryan fantasies to absurd Rambo fantasies. And don't be surprised when you see Nance posting video of himself online behind a trench or some other barrier, and he'll be firing an assault rifle at some enemy that you won't be able to see. It will have to be an assault rifle because he's not a pilot, so he won't be flying any missions like Eugene Bullard did. Nance is also not an artillery gunner, so he won't be firing any big guns either. He's pretty much only qualified to pull a trigger. That's about the most that he knows how to do, so that's what he'll be doing, and he'll make sure to get it on video as his permanent calling card. And in the event that Putin's southern offensive should prove brutal enough to force the Ukrainians to surrender altogether or to agree to a settlement on Putin's terms, which would equate to the same thing, then Malcolm Nance will portray that as having been like the movie 300, and he'll be trying to portray himself as King Leonidas. And when he gets back to the US, you can bet that he'll be making the rounds, going to every movie studio, television studio, and streaming service that he can, trying to see if he can sell his own life rights and try to get some sort of half-baked movie or even mini-series made about himself. But no matter what happens, you can bet that he won't let anyone ever hear the end of this. Well, if nothing else, at least we all know what Malcolm Nance's next book is going to be about. Though I can only imagine what hopeless individuals would waste their time reading it. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Quee, Kenneth Prescia, Wesley Monroe, Elbert Sanders, and Larry Beard. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.